Hey everyone, today we're going to be ranking all 24 of the current killers in Dead by Daylight. For this list, I'm going to rank these killers worst to best with all the player base in mind. So, the killers will be ranked on how well they can perform when a new player plays them, as much as when a rank 1 veteran player does. This is just to give a more rounded view, as often lists like this only focus on that top 1% of players. I'd like to think of this as a ranked list for everyone. If you disagree and have your own ranking you want to drop in the comments, please do. Let's get into it. Starting off this list, in number 24 we have the Trickster. The unfortunate fact of the matter is that Trickster simply is not on the stronger end of killers, whether this be for incredibly experienced DBD players or brand new ones. Those playing Trickster will likely struggle somewhat, and those that face him will likely have a fairly stress-free game in comparison to other killers. From his weak power, his slower movement speed, and his lackluster and awkward charge ability, Trickster has become synonymous with seeing entity displeased on the end screen. Trickster's power is his throwing knives, which he has a total of 60 of. These blades take 8 hits without add-ons to injure a survivor for a health state. They have somewhat of a strange spread, a small amount of recoil, and have to be reloaded in lockers. His charge ability, Main Event, is an ability that activates after achieving enough successful hits with your throwing knives, where it allows you to then release a large flurry all at once and output a decent amount of damage. The issue with Trickster, however, is that all these things sound great, but in game they are simply too weak. His kit effectively makes up parts of other killers' kits, but in a much weaker and underwhelming way. I do like his visual design, however, and I think he's fun, but I don't think he has much of a chance to be played at a high level, and also for newer players. I think they're widely going to have a rough time. At pretty much any skill level, Trickster is probably one of the weakest picks you can make. In number 23 we have the Trapper. Trappers fall into the problem of quite simply being a product of his time, which in the current day of Dead by Daylight is outdated to say the least. Trapper can't keep up with the newer killers and their much more multifaceted or simply powerful abilities. It doesn't help either that he is greatly restricted by many things that reduce his quality of life, such as the fact that he has to collect his traps by hand, he only starts with a singular trap without add-ons, and that even when he captures someone, RNG plays a part, which is never a good thing. Trapper, in my opinion, is great as he is just so simple to learn. Power is bear traps. You pick them up and you hope a survivor walks into one, or you can help guide them into one. Although he can be learned easily, mastering him is a whole other thing and something that requires good map knowledge and a lot of the time just a lot of playtime in order to fully understand the game and the survivors you face. His setup and map pressure is slow and bad, and everything good that comes out of Trapper at mid to high tier play is typically the skill of the player playing him with very little reliance on the power itself. However, if you get a good player then they can perform well, but I would argue it's gonna take a good amount of time to hit that skill level due to the map knowledge required as one of the biggest factors in perfecting trap placements. Trapper to a degree though is still more friendly to newer players than Trickster, as his power is basic in terms of how it works, and Trapper also has a regular movement speed, meaning if a game is going poorly you can still resort to simple M1s. In number 22 we have the Clown. My opinion of Clown has shifted a lot over the past year or so, but I think my general conclusion in regard to the wider player base is that he isn't that great. Clown provides his best potential with his bottles, which slow down survivors who run through its cloud. The reason why this is typically so effective is because there's not really any way to counter this aside pre-dropping most pallets. And this makes Clown a fairly boring killer to face, but also to play as. Most survivors will not try to loop you whilst in your smoke. Clown's power is a switchable one between 2 bottles. One bottle slows, the other speeds up. The pink slows, the yellow speeds up. You can change the bottle effect by simply tapping a button. The yellow is a fairly new addition and one which I don't think has much value, quite frankly, as the effect not only takes a while to spawn, but only provides you with an additional 10% movement speed for 5 seconds. It can help slightly for map traversal and pressure, but generally I found it's best to just use the slowdown bottles. Even if these ones that speed you up can help you briefly on larger maps, often you'll have to reload by the time you arrive, so you may as well just not use the yellow bottles. The reason why Clown can hold his own to some degree is that his bottles can be hard to counter for new players. I personally remember finding him difficult to counter when I started playing. Even for more experienced players, due to the lack of Clown players, often even they don't really know what to do. This and his average movement speed mean he does have some benefits in the midst of the negatives. In our number 21 spot we have the Pig. I always hate placing her this low as she has a very cool power, but Pig requires a high degree of skill and engagement as well as general game knowledge to do well in high high to mid-tier games. Admittedly, her power works well against newer players, as they are an easy means to cause panic but also to decay gens, as survivors favour removing the trap rather than doing the generators. Pig's primary power is her reverse bear traps. These traps are placed onto downed survivors' heads and explode after a fairly long timer, and can only be removed through searching jigsaw boxes scattered around the map. These boxes and the escape attempts for reverse bear traps are RNG based. RNG, or random number generation, is the bane of many killers' existences. Whenever RNG is involved, killers like Pig become even weaker, RNG being a large part of her reverse bear traps, which will vary on how long it takes or how many tries it takes for you to remove them as a survivor. The reason why this is so bad is that you can't really calculate properly different timings and work out a strategy for maintaining consistent pressure when you're relying on luck. Aside this, her secondary powers such as her stealth is actually quite restrictive, as it disallows you from attacking, makes you slower, and also restricts visibility by putting you closer to the floor. You can do the ambush attack, an attack which lunges you forward in a sprint, alerting players with a roar. This can be used for some interesting plays on loops, but generally it doesn't come in all too useful, and the crouch is something you're probably going to be using solely for the stealth element and not so much the attack element. I'll admit the Pig can be effective when played efficiently, and generally sometimes the bear traps can really throw off teams, as they're often prone to panicking when they get a trap put on them. Pig simply does not have enough strength or pressure, and her reliance on RNG makes her unreliable in my opinion though. In number 20, we have the Shape. Myers is a killer that has a scaling power from tier 1 to 3, each tier making him more powerful, and each tier gained through stalking survivors, which is done by simply holding down the power button and looking at a survivor. At tier 3, survivors will become exposed, you get faster, and also vault faster too. Myers is kind of hit and miss in my opinion, as he requires some skill for sure, in that you have to be sneaky in how you go about stalking, but also knowing when to hit instead and apply some pressure. But this is also something to a degree that every killer needs, is good positioning, as well as maximizing the potential of his tier 3, which can go by fast if you're not too careful. Tier 3 is where the real damage is done. So tier 3 is something you really need to make the most of. Typically the best strategy is slugging or downing someone and insta-hooking, as both of these things apply pressure and will have a great likelihood to force the rest of the survivors off of gens. Myers has a big benefit when it comes to his kit, which allows for varied play but also some incredibly overpowered things to happen within the game. Some of the add-ons allow you to insta-mori survivors at tier 3, and others allow for infinite tier 3. Both are pretty insane. Myers can feel inconsistent, as a big map can kill him, and bad map spawns can result in a game lost, meaning you need to be on the ball and finding survivors from the get-go. When playing Myers, there's always got to be a consideration that your early game will be slow, which can be tricky for both new and experienced players alike. However, the payoff is often enough to turn the tables, as Myers is a great killer for snowballs in the mid to late game. For our number 19 spot, we have the Legion. Legion is one of the most tossed about killers in the whole killer roster. They've been through nerfs and buffs and constant updates, and generally they just come out at the other end as exceedingly average. Legion's power, Feral Frenzy, lets you run faster and put survivors into the deep wound state, a state which requires the survivor to mend themselves after a short while of not being chased. This power is solely good for the fact that it can easily allow you to put a whole squad of survivors into the injured state in a very quick duration. There's another benefit also in that when you hit the first survivor in Frenzy, you'll get Killer Instinct on nearby survivors, meaning there is some ability to use the Legion's power for information and map control to a degree. The issue with Legion is that if a team chooses not to heal, or the survivors spread out, which really doesn't take too much communication or strategy, then the Legion is left in an awkward spot where their power can feel very underwhelming, and they get reduced to being a basic M1 killer who can also sprint slightly faster sometimes. Legion's add-ons are broadly kinda useless, with an iridescent that's pretty powerful, as Legion, whether you're new or experienced, the broad experience of them is one of difficulty and constant feeling of being underpowered or simply lacking a more complex kit. In number 18, we have Nemesis. The main issue with Nemesis is his awkward tentacle strike that seems to only land some of the time, even when it feels like it should be hitting. It further lacks enough difference between its first tier and third, where for someone like Myers the difference between the two is night and day. For Nemesis, often it can feel barely noticeable. Nemesis's power is his tentacle strike, which infects survivors on its first hit, making the survivors sick and generally louder and easier to track, requiring a vaccine to cleanse them of this. Once they're infected, each consecutive hit will damage them as a normal attack would. You'll only gain progress to tearing your tentacle up whenever you infect upon hitting. Nemesis also also has 2 AI zombies that roam around the map to help you infect and also down survivors. You can also kill these zombies with your tentacle in order to gain some more progress towards tearing up. Nemesis is honestly kind of reliant on his zombies at the moment and lacks quite a bit for a killer who seems to lean on his ranged attack. Unlike Pyramid Head, this strike does not go through walls, nor does it allow to hit consistently over low clearance objects. Nemesis' reliance on RNG and AI zombies and the ineffective ability which he is supposed to gain most of his power from leaves him in a strange spot. For newer players, this can often not be so bad, I think, as it would result in lots of free downs due to the zombies, especially in the indoor maps. But for high tier play, I think it would require a good amount of practice as well as luck to perform well with him consistently, due to the many inconsistencies that he currently has. Indoor maps are Nemesis' best friend due to his zombies, but on an open wide map, you kinda lose that element too. In number 17, we have the Twins. The Twins are a killer that is potentially the least played out of any killer, their power consisting of the ability to switch between the 2 twins, Charlotte and Victor. Charlotte being the slower one, but also capable of picking the survivors up. Victor alternately is fast moving and capable of leaping long distances to inflict states of damage or attach to healthy survivors, making them oblivious, broken and incapacitated, as well as revealing all close survivors through killer instinct. Despite many opting for a camping strategy with the Twins, there are more creative things to be done, but I would argue the majority of these strategies require a decent amount of practice and generally are not too friendly for new players. I believe the average Twins player is going to struggle somewhat when it comes to map control and the managing of each of the Twins, with little help from add-ons and a need to lean towards stronger perks for help. I think much of the reason why these killers aren't great is because there's not too many people who have actually put the time in to learn them, nor is there a breadth of knowledge available out there on how to play them well. I think the split killer that basically is the Twins can feel quite intimidating. Although the concept is cool, I think this is off-putting for new players and doesn't provide enough of a reward for more experienced ones to learn them, leaving them in a weird spot and just a very average spot, honestly. In number 16, we have Ghostface. Ghosty is a relatively unchanged killer since his 2019 launch, and also still can fall victim to odd bugs and annoying mechanics. However, out of all of the stealth killers, I still think that Ghostface is one of the best ones, and is a far more forgiving character for newer players whilst also allowing interesting strategy and a moderate skill curve for those at a higher level. Ghostface's main ability is his Stalk, which is similar to Myers except it doesn't work collectively, it works for individuals, and will be indicated as such on your screen. Each time you complete a stalk action, the survivor you stalked will become exposed after a certain amount of time. And the benefit of this in comparison to Myers though is that Ghostface can do it far quicker, despite it lasting for less time, only 45 seconds. A good and widely used strategy being to 99 the stalk bar before getting close and tapping it to get an instant down. To assist Ghosty's stalking, he can lean and also crouch. Whilst crouch, he is further undetectable, making him probably the stealthiest killer in the game. It's also good to note that when leaning, he also stalks quicker than usual. A key thing for Ghostface I find is getting a good balance between stalking but also applying enough pressure and not being overly passive, as otherwise the generators can fly by quickly. You really can't just urban evade around the map and expect results. Without his power active, he is a pretty standard M1 killer who you can't really go wrong with. New players can do well with Ghostface due to his simplicity. I think probably more so than Myers, whose early game can trip newer players up a bit more. With Ghosty, even if you aren't great with his power, the silent elements help a lot and can easily help lead to gen grabs and such, which are effectively insta downs in themselves. For more experienced players, things such as the crouch can become key parts in pulling off interesting tricks and gaining sneaky hits. Overall, Ghostface is straightforward, fun, and accessible. In 15, we have the Demogorgon, who despite numerous add-on nerfs is quite consistent regardless and has come to be one of my favourites despite its relatively average kit. The Demo's first ability is the Shred attack, an extended lunge with a wider area coverage. When using Shred, you can move at 460% movement speed for this attack. This means you can get some very quick and also long range hits. However, you do need to be cautious when using it at long range, as often survivors can make a quick last second movement and you'll go flying right past them. This allows for strategies where you can fake using your Shred and then moving forward for an easy M1, as they are distracted by preparing a dodge. Demo is a very fun killer for both sides and probably one of the most balanced killers currently in the game. This partly comes down to its average map control, which comes through its main power, portals. These can be placed basically anywhere on the map as long as the surface is flat and large enough, and once you've placed them, you can tunnel your way between them whenever you want as long as you're standing on a portal location. You also get a total of 6, so there's a good chance to cover a decent area. These portals can be effective to get to certain areas and keep map pressure, helped by their very short cooldown and pretty quick travel between points. However, these portals stand out clearly and can be broken by survivors, so often you have to kind of get lucky for them to stay intact if you want them in good areas, as survivors typically will target them if they have been spotted. Demo, despite his number 15 spot in my heart, will always be number 1. Hillbilly is in our number 14 spot, and a killer that has recently become a lot less played due to the fairly minor change made to his chainsaw. Billy, in my opinion, is still a very formidable killer, and the cooldown mechanic for his chainsaw has not really made too much of a difference for your average player. As someone who is very average with Billy, I found my games to be very similar to how they used to be. Despite Billy being a killer since the very start of the game, he hasn't fallen victim as much to Trapper's issue of feeling underwhelming, as at his core and through simplicity, Billy can perform to a high standard. Billy's power is his chainsaw sprint, an ability which lets him run at 9.2 meters per second, which is double a regular killer's walk speed. While sprinting, if the chainsaw collides with a survivor, it will instantly down them. This in itself is great. A large part of Billy, however, is that his chainsaw is as much a killing tool as it is a tool for movement and map traversal, allowing him to keep generators under control and get between points very quickly. Sure, you have to be alert and still keep an eye on the gens, but the chainsaw allows you to at least have that chance to reach them quicker. I think the main difficulty and skill curve of Billy comes with the chainsaw's turning circle and control, which can feel quite stiff at times, although this can be helped along by add-ons. It also doesn't help that colliding with objects will break you out of your sprint, unlike Oni's charge. One of the older killers, but certainly not a weak one. Cannibal is our number 13, and a character that is basically just a simple and more forgiving hillbilly with a literal wider spread and easier to use chainsaw that can still give opportunity to skillful plays and provides somewhat high, albeit lower than Hillbilly's, skill ceiling. Bubba's power allows him to rev up his chainsaw and swing it side to side whilst moving at a higher speed. This chainsaw sweep can be extended with use of charges that will allow you to choose to add more distance if needed to catch a survivor. These charges and his generally beefier self allow him to perform very well on loops and also against large groups of survivors who are close together, as they are really all at threat of being downed, which is the benefit I'd argue over Hillbilly's chainsaw, which is restricted to only downing a singular person at any given time. Bubba also has a decent amount of good add-ons, and now also has iridescent ones too, and generally has his own set of gear instead of reskins and adjusted versions of Billy's, which optimize him. I don't want to touch on perks too much, but in regards to teachables, they pair pretty well with his loadout, but are also some great ones to pick up as a new player. So if you're new, Bubba's a good choice to learn generally how DBD works, or specifically how insta-down killers work, before you move on to someone like Hillbilly, say, who is a little bit trickier to use, and does, quite frankly, take a little bit more skill. This is also why I would argue Bubba is a better pick and higher up this list for the average player, as there is a more forgiving skill curve and also a lower skill ceiling. In number 12, we have our favorite cowboy, Deathslinger. Deathslinger's power is his spear gun, which quite simply is a gun that shoots a spear, and if this spear hits a survivor, he is able to reel them in and hit them. If this is done, it'll also apply the deep wound effect as a result. The main part to Deathslinger's power is aim, as good aim means broadly you'll be able to use his power well. I find this is a pretty transferable skill if you're someone who has played any FPS games in the past. The main downside to this power is that when shot, the spear gun does have projectile speed, a distance cap, and I think a slight drop off, so you have to be cautious and somewhat learn the weight of the weapon, if that makes sense. It feels like Slinger is one of those killers you either pick up super quickly or you take a while to learn based on how quickly you can figure out the usage of the rifle itself. For someone who likes more precision, Deathslinger is a great, slightly quieter alternative to Huntress, who's always humming, as Slinger has a small terror radius despite having long range. Slinger's main downfall being that he can be quite slow at times, and his map control can be hard to retain, but as long as you're hitting shots and finding survivors, you should be able to perform well with him. As his great strength is that there's little counterplay for him, as his power is more reliant on your shots hitting and has less to do with how the survivors choose to try and outplay you. For number 11, we have the Plague. Plague's main power is her Vile Purge, which is a stream of vomit that requires you to hit the survivors until they eventually become injured. You can also infect survivors by infecting affecting objects like generators and totems, where if touched, the sickness will rub off. If injured through this sickness, they'll also become broken, meaning they can't heal. Further, when sick, they'll make loud noises and occasionally throw up, making them far easier to track. Once sick, all survivors will have to cleanse to be healthy once more, which unlocks your Corrupt Purge, which is red vomit that damages for a single health state. This is incredibly powerful and acts as a long-range ability that can down multiple survivors at a time if you manage to hit multiple with a single stream. If survivors don't cleanse, you also get a free pool of the red vomit at the start of the game that you can access at any time. Along with all this, Plague gets some of the best add-ons in the game. She has some really strong stuff in her loadout, both for information and also just straight up power. Her add-ons are really great and also pretty diverse too. The only drawback to Plague in my opinion is that she can be a little tricky to learn as a new player, as there's somewhat a level of micromanagement and keeping track of what or who you've infected. However, I think that Plague is pretty perfect to be placed near the midpoint of this list, as I feel most average players against an average team can play and have a very even game against the survivors. In number 10 we have the Wraith. Wraith is in a very good state right now after his relatively sizable buff that made his invisibility better and also his cloaked movement speed quicker. Wraith, even after these changes, is still quite underrated. Sure, he takes some practice and can be a little punishing when learning him, but I think due to his ability to surprise players and move around the map incredibly stealthily, he can become quite deadly against lesser and more experienced teams of survivors alike. Wraith's power is very simple. He rings a bell and he goes invisible. He rings it again and he's no longer invisible. Also, after uncloaking, you get a small boost of speed to get that initial hit. Whilst he is invisible, you also can't hear his terror radius, making it very easy to sneak up to players who are stationary, with some easy chase strategies focusing on using your invisibility to block the survivors from reaching pallets or windows. Wraith has access to great add-ons such as the Bone Clapper or Silent Bell, which can honestly feel unfair on occasion, especially on maps with lots of corners and lack of long-range visibility. It becomes a guessing and prediction game of where you're coming from. All of his add-ons in fact are very good, as well as quite fun and unique, and all change him up in different ways and almost always good ways. He doesn't really have the issue other killers have of having weird counterproductive add-ons. For newer players and higher ranks, Wraith can be a hard killer to face. I remember when I started playing DBD, Wraith was by far the hardest killer to counter because my awareness that early on was very poor, and so I would always find myself getting caught off guard by a Wraith player. This is of course a drawback, however, later on when you get into the lower ranks and higher skill tiers, as most higher ranked survivors will be pretty attentive and most likely will spot you coming unless you plan your approach carefully, which can be somewhat countered, as when you get near to them you can use stuff like trees and other visibility blockers to hide your invisibility shimmer as you grow closer to them, which can't be seen when you're far away. A sizable drawback for Wraith is the fact that he can only be in one place at any given time, meaning his map control is quite poor despite his speed, and you'll find you'll often have to opt for a tighter gen patrol strategy over anything else, although his quicker speed somewhat patches this issue. Overall, I love Wraith a lot, and he comes in here at number 10. In number 9 we have the Doctor. A great thing about Doctor is that although his power is simple, it still has complexity within the simplicity. The more you learn to utilize it in different scenarios and on different maps, the better it gets. The Doctor is up there for killers I would recommend to very new players who want to learn the basics of playing killer, as he is largely reliant on his basic attack and forces a heavy focus on learning loops and general play around pallets and windows. Further, Doctor's quick and easy capability to locate survivors, which can often be hard when new to the game. Generally, a power that allows you to locate survivors with ease is one to be valued and becomes just as big of a part to making his kit good as it is for affecting loops. Doctor's power allows him to let out a shockwave which ripples across the floor. When a survivor walks through this, they will briefly become locked from vaulting or dropping pallets, basically interacting with things. This also means for when they try to unhook people and such, meaning you can trap them on one side of a loop for an easy hit after shocking them. The other part of Doctor's power is the larger shock, which charges passively over time. This shock lets out a large shockwave that covers the map and reveals everyone within your terror radius with screams. The more you shock survivors, the more madness tiers they go up in. The higher the madness, the more screaming they'll do and the more debuffs they'll get. They'll also see hallucinations, which you can see too and actually kind of use to figure out where the survivors are, giving him an extra element of information to his power. There's not an abundance of complexity for Doctor, but this works in his favor. Everything for him is quite quite straightforward once you understand the basics of how it works. Doctor can be played well by just about anyone, with the right time put in, I think. In number 8 we have the Executioner, a killer which feels weaker than he used to be honest. Whether this is just due to him being out for longer, or that he has somewhat fallen in power, I'm not totally sure. Executioner can do a whole lot though. His abilities include a ranged attack that can fire through walls and pallets, allowing him to get hits even when at a distance or mid-chase. This ability is very solid and is something you do need to rely on somewhat on longer loops if you want to keep the chases as short as possible. It's a key thing to be used over your M1, as there is a brief period where if you cancel this attack you can't immediately attack afterward. Further, Pyramid Head can drag his knife around and create trails. These trails, when walked on by a survivor, will torment them and also reveal them with killer instinct. When tormented, a survivor can instantly be sent to a cage, allowing you to cut some time down without needing to hook them. And this means Pyramid Head is also one of the only killers that can circumvent perks like Unbreakable and DS, as he can cage people, meaning you never have to interact with either of these things. The only drawback being that you do lose the location of the survivor you cage, and often this will lead to the survivor getting saved much quicker. Once a survivor has been hooked or caged twice and is tormented, you can also use a quick Mori on them, which is pretty cool. And again, save some time. Pyramid Head is accessible, I would say, to most people, although he is definitely more suited to more experienced players, as being new and starting out with him can feel a little punishing due to his large kit. Huntress comes in next in our number 7 spot. Huntress is an incredibly simple killer with a power consisting of hatchets that she can throw and then reload at lockers, with each of these damaging for a single health state. Her add-ons allowing for more hatchets, faster projectile speed, and the capability to apply debuffs. Everything about Huntress and everything you need to be good with her is largely to do with getting good with her hatchet. Huntress is still the best range killer in the game in my opinion. As I said for Deathslinger, ranged or aim-based killers are good for new and experienced players alike, as they rely mainly on the transferable skill that is aim. If you can aim, you can basically do well with Huntress to a degree. Huntress has the unique terror radius of a song that she hums, which extends to 45 meters, meaning there's always a degree of pressure despite your slower movement, as the hum will somewhat cause panic to the survivors, as they think you're approaching. Huntress is simple, and she kind of always has been, leaving her in a spot where there's a ton of information out there on her and her power, and a core ability that revolves around a mechanic debatably easy to learn even if it is harder to truly master. Huntress earns this 7th spot. In number 6 we have the Blight. I've had a bit of a roller coaster with Blight, but I think by playing him some more I've come to really appreciate the true capability that he has. After Nurse, Blight is probably the best killer when it comes to map traversal. In some ways he's arguably better. Blight's power allows him to sprint into walls or objects, bounce, and then run high speeds with a lethal attack. You can use the bounces to gain interesting angles and make some loops very easy to traverse around. It'll take practice for sure to get good at moving around loops as Blight, but when you manage to do it, it is very rewarding. For the more experienced players, Blight also allows for powerful maneuvers or strategies such as J flicking or Z flicking now I think, I don't know, I can't keep up, but basically there's a lot of crazy flicks and tricks to be done with him. Blight does have downsides in that indoor maps aren't really his best friend, and it can be easy to get carried away with bouncing and go a bit out of control, but broadly when you hone Blight down, he can become an absolute machine, and I do think this is achievable for most fairly average players like myself. Also a great array of add-ons too, as a little bonus. Hag is here at number 5. For newer and less experienced players, Hag is quite hard to play. The only redeeming thing to this difficulty is the ease of use that is the strat of camping with Hag, which is by far the most likely strategy you'll see with Hag players, as again it's just the easiest and also one of the most effective. Hag is the best trap killer in the game when it comes to her ability to corner a team extremely easily. If you get trapped in a 3-gen with Hag, then you aren't surviving that 3-gen. Hag's traps are placed and triggered when a survivor runs close to them. When triggered, they will spawn a phantasm, blocking the survivor's path and also giving the Hag a brief window to teleport over to the trap that was just triggered to then hit the survivor. She gets 10 traps, all of which are accessible to her at the start of the game. This is kind of what makes her so insane at holding down an area. The only issue I have with putting her here is how hard a newer player might find using Hag, as I recall my own early games with her where I struggled greatly. I think Hag has a rough start when learning her, but I think 10 or so games in and you'll get the hang of it. She's not entirely new player friendly, but she is also strong against new players respectively, meaning it's even for how unfair it is basically. Hag can be truly amazing, but she also takes a lot of learning to play her effectively. The Nightmare of Freddy is here in our number 4 spot. Despite the nerfs to the Dream World and his different regression effects and trap play speed, Freddy is still very powerful and for a new player probably the best choice, as solid one for a mid-tier player and still a fairly reliable one for someone in the top tier. Freddy is a killer that can be played well by anyone, as most of his abilities are passive, and even the ones you directly control, such as the snares, have basically no drawbacks or ways you can use them poorly or incorrectly. His main power and most useful power is his snares, which you can place quickly, best used on loops to slow down survivors who trigger them, so you can get easy hits. These are less useful for more strategic area control, and are better used to quickly gain an advantage in a small area or mid-chase. The alternative to snares are dream or fake pallets, which allow Freddy to spawn fake pallets into the world, tricking survivors who try to drop them, most of the time leading to an easy hit. These can work on occasion and may especially work out well as a newer player, but this will fade with the more experience you and your opposition gain. Freddy has a very powerful tool, the Dream World, which makes his direction and also visibility very difficult for survivors to discern. He can also teleport from gen to gen on a shortish cooldown, so he has great map control too and can retain pressure within an instant. You really don't need too much experience or skill to use Freddy, and to an extent, despite his nerf state, he still acts almost like a tutorial killer who buffs you as the player in a ton of ways to make your life easy and allow you to perform well. Coming in at number 3, we have the Oni. Oni to me is a killer I believe is capable of being incredibly consistent across the board when it comes to varying degrees of skill level and experience within the game. With his main power being somewhat passive and helpful to players of all skill levels, Oni's main power relies on gathering blood, which you do from hitting survivors, who will then drop it, a bit like they do anyway when hit, except with Oni they'll drop it in big blobs. You suck the blood up, and once you've gained enough you can go into your power, Blood Fury, and sprint at very high speeds as well as insta-down. Oni is pretty power reliant, I'll be honest. Pretty much any killer who begins weak has to be somewhat reliant on their powerful state. However, for Oni you really don't have to wait too long, nor need to get lucky with the map, as his power is down to simply actively pressuring the survivors, making it productive to try and get your power even if you don't get it right away. Oni to me is the best killer to snowball games with within the game, at least for the average player. The potential he has to go from target to target in his sprint, his ability to take a team down one by one is nothing short of insane, and something that is relatively easy to learn or pick up, as when you collide with objects, you won't be pulled out of your power or sprint. Oni also has great add-ons that reduce charge time and also extend Blood Fury and Blood Fury speed, making you pretty unstoppable once you have enough people injured and constantly dropping blood. It basically turns into an endless power. Oni is fun, accessible, and powerful, and here at number 3. In number 2 we have the Nurse. The last time I did a list like this, I placed Nurse a bit lower in number 4, primarily due to her very punishing gameplay for newer players. My perception on this has changed as of recent, however, and although I think for many, including myself, find her challenging, there is also an abundance of old and new players who are incredibly skilled with her, many of which have done so simply because her power is so, well, powerful. Nurse's power is called Blinking, a blink being an ability that allows you to phase forward and make a ton of ground in seconds. The blink allows her to jump between locations in quick succession and hit as she does. The only drawback to these blinks being a short stun at the end of each blink, and a cap of 2 chained blinks before this stun occurs. Her map coverage, potential, and speed is a lot like Blight, except a lot more instant and less restricted by the environment in which she is in, as she can directly phase through a wall at any point if she wants to. Nurse also gets add-ons that extend her blink range, reduce her fatigue after blinking, and allow her to recharge her blink charges even quicker. Nurse is kind of a machine, and I think new players can be very adept with her, and further greatly experienced players can cause utter annihilation when blinking through the trials. In our number 1 spot we have the Spirit. Spirit quite simply is the most powerful character in the game currently when looking at the player base as a whole. Typically Nurse may be considered the best, but Spirit I find is much more universally agreed upon to be easy to play. Spirit's power is simple. She can phase walk, she goes invisible briefly and can no longer see survivors while doing this, but you can move faster and see scratch marks, so you can still figure out locations, especially if you're attentive to the environment, such as moving plants and sounds of breathing or survivor injured noises. Spirit takes a little while to figure out with her tracking, but once you get the hang of it, which I think most do quite quickly, she becomes near unstoppable as her counters, well, it's debated if she actually has any at all. Her power is insanely good, as when she phases, she leaves behind a husk, and as the survivors can't see you, they can't tell when you're phasing or for how long or where you are. So they basically have to guess. The best best means of dodging or avoiding her attacks is to guess whether she is phasing or not, and to do your best to dodge. One of Spirit's main strategies in mind games is simply standing still, often resulting in the survivor running right into you as they don't know what to do. And this means you will pretty consistently manage to get a hit every time as long as you track them properly, which often isn't too hard. Spirit makes loops near impossible, and she allows almost complete circumvention of the game's typical rule sets. Yup, she's insane, and she's our number one. Well, I think that's going to do it for today. I do hope you enjoyed. Be sure to drop your own list down below. Thanks, and goodbye.